Notwithstanding Rule 22, the cloture vote on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048 start immediately.
Both of them. Can't. Followed immediately by the second cloture vote.
Immediately by the second cloture vote.
If cloture is not invoked.
If cloture is not invoked.
Is there objection? Without objection. Clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048, an act to reform the authorities of the federal government to require the production of certain business records, conduct electronic surveillance, use pen registers and trap and trace devices, and use other forms of information gathering for foreign intelligence, counterterrorism, and criminal purposes and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048, an act to reform the authorities of the federal government to require the production of certain business records, conduct electronic surveillance, use PIN registers and trap and trace devices, and use other forms of information gathering for foreign intelligence, counterterrorism, and criminal purposes, and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and the nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito.
Okay. All right.
Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Coates. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey.
How you doing?
Mr. McCain.
So call me.
Mrs. McCaskill.
Just have this guy give you a call on my cell phone. We'll visit. And not.
Mr. McConnell.
I'm with you. You've seen my criticism.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley.
Yeah.
Ms. Mikulski.
Can you just help this along? You have children. Tell them you have children.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue.
So it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if they're 2 or if they're 15.
Mr. Peters.
And this is ridiculous because it doesn't matter.
Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass.
The only stuff I know is from Hogan's Heroes.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
Well, that's great.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Gardner, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hoven, Kane, Lankford, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Wyden. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Inhofe, Isaacson, McConnell, Paul, Perdue, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Thune, Wicker. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Markowski. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye.
If all senators voted, any senators wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 57, the nays are 42. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader of the
Mr.
Senate.
President, Senate's not in order.
We have order, Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I enter a motion to reconsider the vote.
The motion is entered.
Now, Mr. President, the Senate has demonstrated that the House-passed bill lacks the support of 60 senators. I would urge a yes vote on the 2-month extension. Senator Burr, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and Senator Feinstein, the ranking member, as we all know, have been working on a proposal that they think would improve the version that the Senate has not accepted that the House sent over. It would allow the committee to work on this bill, refine it, and bring it before us for consideration. So the 2-month extension, it strikes me, would be in the best interest of getting an outcome that's acceptable both to the Senate and the House and hopefully the President.
Mr. President.
So I would urge a yes vote.
Mr. President.
Senator from
Mr. President.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that since a strong bipartisan majority of the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to the USA Freedom Act, that the motion to proceed be agreed to, that the bill then be read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the USA Freedom Act.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, let's be clear what happened here. We tried with a majority to protect this country, and the Republicans objected. Let's be clear.
Regular order has been called for.
Mr. President.
Debate's not called. Debate's not in order.
Mr. President, if I may, I'd like to point of personal privilege. Mr. President, I would like to correct the majority leader, regretfully. I did not support the Burr bill. I do not believe that's the way to go. I've taken a good look at this. For those who want reform and want to prevent the government from holding the data, the Freedom Act is the only way to do it. The House has passed it. The President wants it. All of the intelligence personnel have agreed to it. And I think not to pass that bill is really to throw the whole program, that whole Section 215, as well as the whole business records, the lone wolf, the roving wiretaps, into serious legal jeopardy.
Regular order, Mr. President.
Regular order. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to S. 1357, a bill to extend authority relating to roving surveillance and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 16 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the motion to proceed to S. 1357, a bill to extend authority relating to roving surveillance, access to business records, and individual terrorists as agents of foreign powers under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 until July 31, 2015, and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte.
White, no.
Hernwick.
Ms. Blunt votes yes.
White House, no. Yes.
Rounds, yes. Johnson, yes.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Yes, sir. I have you. Sure. Thank you. Sure.
Aye.
Yes. Sure. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Coates, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inzie, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott. Thank you. Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Donnelly, Ernst, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johnson, Lankford, McCain, McConnell, Nelson, Perdue, Portman, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Carper, Coons, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gardner, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Kane, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Paul, Peters, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Markey, no.
Fisher, yes.
Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. McConnell? No.
Thanks so much. Who says senators are chosen? Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? Senate will be in order. If not, on this vote, the yeas are 45, the nays are 54. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Could we have order in the Senate?
Senate will be in order.
I would say to my colleagues, it's clear there aren't 60 votes in the Senate for the House passed bill, and there aren't 60 votes for a 60-day extension. So I'm going to propound a series of consent agreements to see if we can avoid having the program expire roughly a week from now. Therefore, I ask the Senate now proceed to a bill to extend the expiring provisions until June the 8th, that the bill be read a third time and passed with no intervening action or debate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object, we have entered into a momentous debate. This is a debate about whether or not a warrant with a single name of a single company can be used to collect all the records, all of the phone records of all of the people in our country with a single warrant. Our forefathers would be aghast. One of the things they despised was general warrants. This is a debate that should be had, and the reason I am objecting is because I've made a very simple request to have amendments, to have them voted on, and to have a guarantee that they're voted on. I started out the day with a request for 6 amendments. I'm willing to compromise to having 2 amendments at a simple majority vote. I think that's a very reasonable position, and if we can't have that, and we can't have an extensive debate over something we've had 4 years to prepare for, I will object, and I do. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I renew my request with an amendment to extend the expiring authorities until June the 5th.
Is there objection? President. Without objection? Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I renew my request with an amendment to extend expiring authorities till June the 3rd.
Is there objection? Without objection?
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I'll defer to the senator from New Mexico if he wishes to make the objection.
Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I renew my request with an amendment to extend expiring authorities until June the 2nd.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Enter your motion to reconsider. You need to enter your motion to reconsider.
I thought I did. I enter my motion to reconsider.
The motion is entered.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I ask that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Is there objection? Objection is heard.
Say,
his substitute. We're not happy with the 702. I even ran across that he was happy. He would not, I mean, he would change our so we would reject the change.
Yeah.
What's that?
I know they're controversial.
No, the substitute, we don't care.
Okay, so he's going to announce that we're going to come back in on Sunday, May 31st, before the expiration in the afternoon, and that we're
Pat,
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I ask further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Is there objection? Without objection?
Yeah, my colleagues, here's where we are. We are unable to clear any short-term extensions, and the current law expires at midnight on Sunday. So the Senate will be back in session Sunday afternoon, a week from Sunday.
May 30th.
Thank you, Senator Schumer.
2 Sundays coming.
We'll be back in Sunday, May the 31st. One more opportunity to act responsibly, to not allow this program to expire. This is a high-threat period, and we know what's going on overseas. We know what's been tried here at home. My colleagues, do we really want this law to expire? We've got a week to discuss it. We'll have one day to do it. So we better be ready next Sunday afternoon to prevent the country from being endangered by the total expiration of the program that we're all familiar with. Unless there is objection, and I understand there is an objection, is not an objection, we'll pass the highway extension on a voice vote tonight, and we'll be back in session Sunday a week.
Would my friend yield for a question? Would my friend yield for a question?
I yield for a question.
We would be happy to cooperate in passing the surface transportation bill by voice. But I do say this, and I mentioned this to you off the, away from the microphones. For those of us living in the West, we can't get back our Sunday afternoon. I mean, I think it's very difficult for us to get back here on a weekday before 5 o'clock. So I would hope on a Sunday we wouldn't be expected for the Senate to come in session before 5 o'clock because we can't get here. And I'm protecting the western part of my caucus, which is pretty big. I'm not going to agree to anything unless we can come in at least after 5 o'clock.
Well, as my friend the Majority Leader knows, I'd be happy to work with him on that, and he also knows I just tried to get an extension, a short-term extension of a variety of different lengths in order not to put us in this position. But we're left with this option only, and we'll work with the Democratic leader about the actual time, but the law expires at midnight, Sunday a week. And I doubt if there are very many of us who are comfortable with that, maybe a handful. But we need to act responsibly here on behalf of the American people.
I agree.
So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I'm not sure I made it clear to everyone there will be no more votes tonight. We'll see you a week from Sunday.
Thank you.
President. Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
I note I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wanted to speak earlier because I wanted to encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come to a resolution on this problem. We cannot let this country go dark in terms of its ability to do its duty to defend the United States of America. And we got to get off of what we're doing here and start getting down to the business of what we need to do. I've got to believe that tonight the world is watching us and they say, there goes the United States Senate. And there they go home. Ha, ha, ha. They have a program that someone literally tried to disgrace the United States of America and render it helpless in terms of our ability to protect us. The name is Eric Snowden. And then now here we are working on a program that went through the respective committees that is a sound and sensible solution, and we've rejected it. Well, I'm not here to talk about the program, but I'll tell you who I am ready to talk about. The thousands and thousands and thousands of people who work at the National Security Agency. And I want to talk about what they go through every day. They're out there working a 36-hour day trying to defend the United States of America. And they want to work, and they want to work under a law that is constitutional, is legal, is authorized, so that they can do the necessary work to defend the United States of America. They thought they were doing that under the old FISA bill. They thought they were doing that. They were proud of what they were doing it. They mustered everything that they could give to this country. Then along comes Eric Snowden. Then along comes the leaks. And then along comes the pontificating about we've got to worry about privacy. I worry about privacy too, but I also worry about the safety and security of the United States of America. And I watched the nation vilify the men and women who work at this agency. So now, as we work under the current law, which will expire, make no mistake, it will expire, we don't have it together to pass a new law. So they have been vilified for what they have done. They have vilified for what they have done. In many instances, attacked by their neighbors, their children picked on and bullied on because their parents work at this agency. Morale was at a low ebb. Finally, now we're trying to deal and cope with that. They're proud of their work. And what are we doing? We can't even pass a law. We can't even pass a law. Now, I think that is absolutely outrageous. I am so sorry we are going home. I am so sorry we're going home. So now we'll come back next Sunday. I really urge those people who I know are of goodwill and good intention to really work to find a way that when we come back next Sunday, we will be able to vote and move forward and not end up in this ongoing parliamentary quagmire. I worry about our country. And I worry about our ability to govern. This is as serious as it gets. What is the role of a national security agency to be able to operate and function in a way that's constitutional, legal, authorized, and obviously of necessity? So I really feel very strongly about this, Mr. President, and I've watched all this go back and forth and so on. So we spent hours and days and days and days on all of these amendments on trade. That's good. I'm glad we did it, but I'm not glad we took that long. We have this bill. We knew we had this bill. We waited to the last minute. We got ourselves into a jackpot. Now we really have to get our way out. I just cannot speak more forcibly enough about this. And here, well, I will have more to say next week, but I really urge others to really do their very best. I know that there are people here, like my colleague, Senator Feinstein, others who have worked on this. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Okay, then I'll get. I just told you. Some debate. So he's going to say, just 1 second.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I would ask that the quorum call be eviscerated.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 89, H.R. 2353.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 89, H.R. 2353, an act to provide an extension of federal aid, highway, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, Senate will proceed. Is there further debate on the measure?
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, is there going to be unanimous consent request made of the chair on this measure at this point?
The chair's understanding is that there will be a request made.
I will reserve the right to object at that point. All right. President, in the interest of time here, and I know it's early in the morning, I'd just like to make a statement. I'm not going to object to proceeding to this measure, but I would like to make a matter of record what I'm sure the senator from South Dakota already knows, that absent our action at this moment, the Federal Highway Program Authority would expire May 31st. We have just spent the better part of an evening contemplating the expiration of an important law relative to our national security, and we have not resolved it. What is happening here, of course, is a request for a 60-day extension of the Federal Highway Program. I might say, and I'm sure the senator from South Dakota is well aware of this, this is the 33rd short-term extension of our Federal Highway Program. I think all of us understand that a program that once was considered to be the centerpiece of America's infrastructure and its economy has now deteriorated to the point where we are extending it for a month, 2 months, and 3 months at a time. Frankly, it does not serve our country, and it doesn't serve our economy. And it is a reflection on the lack of leadership by those who have the authority in committees and in the House and Senate to propose a measure that becomes a long-term highway program. I just want to make it clear that instead of enacting a 6-year transportation program worthy of our great nation, this Congress continues to limp along down a political highway of excuses. It's coming to an end. There have been lengthy discussions in our Democratic caucus that these continued short-term extensions are unacceptable in this great nation. And I would just say, though we will agree to this 60-day extension, we're serving notice on the majority leader in the Senate as well as the Speaker to do their job and to enact a law that provides the kind of infrastructure that could build America's economy. So I will not object to this request, but notice is given that in this 60 days, it is time for this Congress to act. I yield the floor.
If there's no further debate, the clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 89, H.R. 2353, an act to provide an extension of federal aid highway, and so forth, and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill is passed.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I ask unanimous consent that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
I would ask the quorum call be eliminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations: Executive Calendar number 83, 126, 128, and the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on the nominations in the order listed, and that following disposition of the nominations, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. No further motions be in order to the nominations, that any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection. The clerk will report the nominations en bloc.
Nominations: Department of Defense, Peter Levine of Maryland to be Deputy Chief Management Officer. Department of State, Paul A. Folmsby of Oklahoma to be Ambassador to the Republic of Mali. Stafford Fitzgerald Haney of New Jersey to be Ambassador to the Republic of Costa Rica.
The question occurs on the Levine nomination. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. The question occurs on the Folmsby nomination. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. The question occurs on the Haney nomination. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider all nominations placed on the Secretary's desk in the Foreign Service, that the nominations be confirmed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order, that any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record, the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 91, S802.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 91, S802, a bill to authorize the Secretary of State and the Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development to provide assistance to support the rights of women and girls in developing countries and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the committee reported amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Help Committee be discharged from further consideration of S Resolution 156 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 156, expressing the sense of the Senate with respect to childhood stroke and recognizing May 2015 as National Pediatric Stroke Awareness Month.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro tem, and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make appointments to commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law by concurrent action of the two houses or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that, notwithstanding the adjournment of the Senate, committees be allowed to report bills and reports on Tuesday, May 26th, between the hours of 2 p.m. and 4 p.m.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until the following dates and times to convene for pro forma session only with no business being conducted. Further, that following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session. Tuesday, May 26th, 4 p.m. Thursday, May 28th, 8:30 a.m. Further, that the Senate adjourn on May 28th until 4 p.m. Sunday, May 31st. Following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Following leader remarks, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 4 p.m. on Tuesday, May 26th.
In a late-night session, the Senate voted not to move forward with two bills to reauthorize portions of the Patriot Act. By a vote of 45 to 54, members blocked a bill offered by Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, which would extend current surveillance programs for 2 months until July 31st. And the House-passed version, which would make changes to the NSA's bulk collection of Americans' phone records, was defeated 57 to 42. Both those measures needed 60 votes to advance. 3 provisions of the Patriot Act expire at the end of the month. Earlier tonight, the Senate did approve the Trade Promotion Authority bill to give the president the ability to make global trade deals that would only be subject to up or down votes in Congress. That now goes to the House. And in a voice vote, the Senate approved a 2-month extension for highway funding that was set to expire at the end of the month. The Senate will be out for a week-long memorial holiday next week and will be back Tuesday, May 26th.